So since I last left, quite a lot has happened. Here's a recap by the numbers in case you're just tuning in. 5-hour-long Zoom specials were recorded during our coronavirus quarantine. One Bulgarian member of parliament attacked me on social media. One task force on Wikipedia editing has been formed. And finally, 200 subscribers have been added to our YouTube channel, bringing us to a grand total of over 1,000 subscribers. You heard that correctly, 1,000 subscribers. So before I go on, I want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank each and every one of you. It has truly been the privilege of a lifetime connecting with you. So for today's episode, as you saw on Twitter, I will be doing a 5-part special event to celebrate this special occasion. The topics of each will all be connected to one another, as you can assume. Moreover, they are all timely. They're all relevant. We'll be discussing not only the supposed Slavic migration to the Balkans, but also definitively show why the Macedonians were not, are not, and never will be Bulgarians. And since we have opportunists and charlatans like Kovachev in Bulgaria, by the way, like, comment, and subscribe, and Modesky in Macedonia, adding to this fuel of misinformation, we have to be armed to address this twisted ideology. Along the way, we will also address the white elephant in the room. Are Macedonians descended from the ancient Macedonians, or are they a bunch of Ukrainian swamp dwellers that came in the Balkans? All will be answered. But before I continue, I do want to set the expectations. First of all, this again is a 5-part series, so I promise you, your questions will be answered. I know I'm speaking about a very controversial, very heated topic, but trust me, we will look at it from all possible angles. This first episode is simply setting the stage, setting the scene for our future discussions. And I want to make it abundantly clear to everyone listening right now, by no means do I believe that a massive migration of Slavs from some Ukrainian swamps came into the Balkans and somehow demographically replaced all the indigenous inhabitants, including the Macedonians. And secondly, as we discuss this, I want to pose the following questions for you, so keep them in mind and talk about them as we're doing these videos. First of all, the Egyptians. They today speak Arabic, and they consider themselves, for all intents and purposes, Arabs. So, are we assume the Arabs, who come from Arabia, actually came in and killed off all the original Egyptians? So today, modern Egyptians cannot claim the achievements of the great pyramid builders as a part of their own legacy. Secondly, the French have a Germanic name named after the Franks. They have Celtic Gaulish descent, and they speak a Latin language. Will the Germans claim them as Germans because of their name? Or will the Italians, because of the legacy of the Roman Empire, ever claim them as Italians? And third, the Swedish today speak the Swedish language. But historically, the ancestor to their language has been labeled by linguists as Old Norse or Old Norwegian. Will we ever see the day that Norway demands that Sweden label its language a Norwegian dialect? You got that? I want you to keep those in mind. If so, we're ready to go. You're watching Mario's History Talks. I'm Mario Hristovski, and let's get started. So, to the average Greek online warrior, spinning their wheels in endless hours on comment threads, the supposed biggest tool in their arsenal is the so-called Slavic migration, which, in their limited capacity for thinking, excludes us completely from being Macedonians. Second to this is, of course, calling us Bulgarians, though the really creative do try to combine both into one zinger. not realizing they're just embarrassing themselves even further. After all, they're not really the rhetoricians of Demosthenes, if you know what I mean. But anyways, in order to unpack what exactly happened in history, to try to explain all our present day problems and situations, we have to go to the Middle Ages. We'll first take a look at the Balkans in the area prior to the massive socio-linguistic shifts that brought upon Slavic and other languages to the Balkans we speak today. So, prior to the 5th and 6th century, most of the Balkans was inhabited by various tribes that we will, for purposes of our show, call the Paleo-Balkan tribes. These include people like the Macedonians, the Greeks, the Illyrians, the Thracians, the Dacians, and many others, including smaller groups like Germanic and Roman tribes that eventually settled there. Culturally, we can also divide the Balkans into the more Romanized northern and coastal portions and the more southern Hellenized portions. Note, of course, these are loose cultural identifications. Many clearly not Greek tribes, like the Macedonians, like the Thracians, also fell under this Hellenic sphere, though we can state this did not extend to the peasantry, to the lower class. Demographically, the Balkans at this time were also becoming poorly populated. Not only did many peasants flee their homes altogether to avoid the harsh taxation policies enacted by the Byzantines to fund expensive wars abroad, but from the 3rd to the 5th century AD, the Balkans were subject to regular raids and incursions from the Germanic Goths and the Huns to the north. Both factors led to strong population decline, leaving behind only mostly major fortified cities and poor economic development across the region. However, this does not mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that the native population was completely depopulated nor devastated, as some revisionist historians like to claim today, to abolish any possible links between the modern and the ancient populations. Quite the contrary. In fact, most of the depopulation occurred along villages, along heavily trafficked trade routes, and most of the interior, most of the peasants, major cities also remained intact. However, much like today, the Balkans still wasn't the happiest place to live, and people were still leaving. Nothing new, right? So, not that unexpected. Nonetheless, by the 5th century, a group of tribes living along the Danube River to the north begin to be mentioned in the Byzantine or Roman records, as they're more accurately called. Before that, this group of people was probably mentioned as early back as the 1st and 2nd century under the names Venedi and Suobenoi. According to the Byzantine Goth historian Jordanes, by this time, however, they were grouped under the large umbrella term Sclaveni and Anti, which, despite eventually both just being called Sclaveni in history, they were both ancestors of an earlier group called the Veneti. Pretty simple, right? Now, whether these are the same Veneti as the ancient group living along the Adriatic in ancient times is still the subject of debate. So I'm not really going to comment on that. But the name Veneti has been used to label a lot of people in Europe, across Europe. So it is hard to say. And one quick point to mention that will be important later on, based on available evidence, it's probable that the Anti were originally an Iranian group that had adapted a Slavic language, like many others, and had, for all intents and purposes, become Slavic. Now, to the Byzantines, this was the case. But as the Byzantine historian Procopius states, they were tribes, the Anti and the Sclaveni, they were similar, if not the same, in culture, language, and customs. However, this is still important because it shows that groups that were composed and labeled the Sclaveni were heterogeneous and of mixed origin. But somehow, to the Byzantines, they were still broadly grouped as Slavs. And moreover, Despite being similar, these Sclaveni and Anti were very different politically, but more on this later. So anyway, these Sclaveni and Anti, by the second half of Justinian's reign as emperor in the middle of the 500s, they began to increase their yearly raids into the Balkans, usually to loot and immediately go back across the Danube to their villages. But because the Byzantines were either off fighting wars or because the topography of the Balkans were slow to respond with troops, these Sclaveni were usually able to get away with it. However, by the late 580s AD, these yearly raids started to result in more permanent settlement. This was mostly due to the arrival of the Turkic nomadic group called the Avars in the Danubian river basin. And with Emperor Maurice's failed last-ditch effort to finally fortify the northern boundary in around 600 AD, the Roman border finally collapsed. So, what happens next? Well, these so-called Slavic tribes increase in their numbers, and they start to become more organized. In the early 600s, we have here what is traditionally prescribed as the start of the first permanent Slavic settlements in Macedonia, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece. You heard that right. More on that later. Now, during this time period, we also have the first of the many failed attempts to take the city of Salonika. This was led by a Macedonian Slav by the name of Hadzon, who, unfortunately for us, died in that attempt. This is actually a very important yet overlooked episode in Macedonian history that explains a lot more than you care to imagine about our current situation and our current problems. But that's for another episode. So, while the Macedonian Slavs did not manage to take Salonika, this much is certain. Salonika was thoroughly Slavicized by the 9th century, with Emperor Michael's famous words to St. Cyril and Methodius saying, "You are Thessalonians, and all Thessalonians speak pure Slavic." That's my Emperor Michael impression, not the best. But today, in Solun, you can be sent to the police station for speaking too much pure Slavic openly. Figures, cradle of democracy. But anyways, during this time period, the Slavic tribes began to organize so much that they were actually starting to form these autonomous rebel enclaves called Sclavenias, which extended from the Danube all the way down to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. While still technically under Byzantine rule, for all intents and purposes, Byzantium had lost complete control over these areas to so much of a degree that Emperor Constans II actually tried resettling Slavic troops in Asia Minor. Now, whether these Sclavenias in the region of Macedonia were an early Proto-Slavic Macedonian state in the Balkans is hard to determine, so I will defer making any kind of opinion or judgment on that. But they nonetheless were undoubtedly the first inklings of a unique Macedonian, Slavic, Byzantine cultural expression. And most importantly, with the rapidly failing Byzantine administration across the Balkans, these autonomous Sclavenias became the main authority governing daily life for not only the so-called Slavs, but also the native ancient Macedonians. And as we will see in a future episode, this is one of the factors that contributed to Common Slavic, the language of these Slavs, being adapted by the ancient Macedonians, especially the rural and rustic ones. Moreover, it is during this time period that these Sclavenians are mentioned, that the word Macedonian starts to be referred to and mean Slavonic, as stated in Edward Freeman's Historical Geography of Europe, link down below. Oh, and small footnote. During the same general time period, this small group of recently arrived Turkic nomads tried settling in Macedonia from up north and creating this Hunno-Turkic state in Macedonia. They failed miserably. However, you should probably still know their name. They were called Bulgars. And it would not be for another 100 years that Macedonians would have any contact with these Bulgars when they failed yet again to form a Bulgar state in Macedonia. So, why am I telling you this now, right at the end? Well, it is actually on purpose. All that I just outlined above was happening for centuries before Macedonians had any permanent exposure to the Bulgars. You have to understand that Macedonia was already becoming thoroughly Slavicized before they had any contact with the Hunno-Turkic pagan Bulgars. In fact, it was because of this Slavicized nature that our ancestors resisted any attempts by the Bulgars to form a Bulgar pagan state in Macedonia, specifically by Kuber in the 660s AD. Now, we're going to do a whole separate episode not only on Kuber, but on the arrival of the Bulgars in the Balkans. But you have to understand this much at this stage. At every turn, the ancestors of the Macedonians and the Bulgarians were diametrically opposed and separated from each other. And this resulted in separate identity formations at this period in history. Remember, the Sclaveni and the Anti that I mentioned before? Well, as I said, they may have been similar. The Anti became Slavicized, but different conditions produced vastly different outcomes. So, first of all, the Sclaveni settled mostly in the region of the former Yugoslavia, while the Anti settled mostly in Mysia and Thrace. Today, that's part of Bulgaria. And per the divide and conquer strategy of the Byzantines, especially under Emperor Justinian, he actually made particular efforts to make sure these Sclaveni and Anti were at each other's throats in an attempt to weaken them. So while the Anti became allies of the Byzantines, the Sclaveni, in opposition to Roman rule, remained enemies of the Romans. In fact, they even allied themselves with these Avars to try to take down Byzantine control of Salonika. Furthermore, like I said before, different circumstances led to vastly different outcomes. The Sclaveni in Macedonia found the ancient Macedonians among other Paleo-Balkan tribes, which in many ways formed the modern-day Macedonian people. However, take a look at Bulgaria. The ancestors of the modern Bulgarians are a combination of the Anti, the clan of the seven Slavic tribes, the Thracians, and finally the Turco-Mongolic Bulgars. So, not only did different Slavic tribes settle in Macedonia than those in Bulgaria, but the people already living in Macedonia and Bulgaria would go on to produce, different nations altogether. And let's fast forward slightly here. By the time Macedonia is, for the first time, occupied by the Bulgars, roughly 2 centuries had passed, and thus that had created vastly different outcomes. Let's do the math. If the Sclaveni arrive in Macedonia in roughly 550, it would not be for another 192 years in 843 AD that would find themselves under any actual permanent Bulgar occupation with the Khan Presian. Until then, any contact they had, they resisted. Any attempts at Bulgar intrusion, as we saw in 660 with Kubra and 789 with Kardam, ended up in failure. Now, as we will discuss in future videos, there is reason to believe that these Macedonian Slavic tribes were already mostly Christianized by the mid-800s, when they were, for the first time, permanently under Bulgar occupation. So given that, what do we have by this stage in the 800s? Well, we have a unique Byzantine Slavic Orthodox culture forming in Macedonia. And in pagan Bulgaria, we have a Bulgar Slavic pagan culture forming. But what changed? What changed during this time period? If Macedonians had resisted Bulgar culture numerous times before, what changed to allow them to finally be incorporated into a Bulgarian empire after so many failed attempts? Well, if you watch my videos, you already know the answer. If the Macedonians resisted becoming like the Bulgars would become like the Macedonians, Slavic and Christian. But that, my friends, is the subject for a future video. Oh, and before I let you go, did you really think I would forget to mention our wonderful southern neighbors who continuously like to not only call us Slavs, yet somehow think that they were just magically immune to the Slavic invasion of the Balkans? Of course not. If we ascribe to the idea of a mass Slavic migration to the Balkans, which again, I really don't, and I'll explain that in a future video why, then the Greeks are just as Slavic as we are genetically. Sorry, buddy, the Slavs didn't just magically stop at the Megitlia-Niki border. Let's read some excerpts from John Fine's absolute masterpiece, The Early Medieval Balkans, and I'll let you go. All right, so I'll be reading now from John Fine's book, Early Balkans, and highly recommend you check it out. I'll be reading from pages roughly 59 to 66, just some general excerpts here. I'll tell you when it's a direct quote. So, the controversy of whether the Slavs actually came into the Balkans dates back to 1830, when a German scholar by the name of Mayer wrote in his History of Morea, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, that, in direct quotes here, the Hellenic race is completely exterminated. The physical beauty, the sublimity of spirit, the simplicity of customs, artistic creativeness, races, cities, villages, splendor of columns and temples, even the name of the people itself has disappeared from the Greek continent. So obviously, as you can imagine, much like today, Greeks were not happy to hear this, as fanatical then as they are today. Direct quotes here. The opposition started to deny that the Slavs really penetrated into Greece at all. I mean, why not? But the sources clearly refute such an extreme position, and we have already seen documentation that Slavs settled in Macedonia and Thessaly. So many Slavs had settled around Thessaloniki that the town was described as a Roman island in a Slavic sea by a local source. Weird. I thought Macedonia was 4,000 years Greek and only Greek history, not a little island of Byzantine Roman rule amongst a Slavic sea. Really makes you think. Let's keep going. The controversy then came to be centered on the Peloponnesian Peninsula in southern Greece. Did the Slavs settle there too? The major source on this question is the Chronicle of Monifmasia, which states that the Slavs came into the Peloponnesian Peninsula in 587. And in any case, the direct quote here, in return to the original question, both Bon and Karnassis, two scholars of opposing sides here, admit that the Byzantines lost control of the western, central, and southern parts of Peloponnesus, that this region was heavily settled with Slavs, that this situation lasted from the 6th century until the recovery of the beginning of the 9th century. The only difference between the view of these two scholars is the question of the eastern Peloponnesus, which Karnassis would make Byzantine and Bon would make not. That's the only gray area. Not were they Slavic, the regions, how Slavic were they? That's the only dispute that exists. Let's keep going. In another analysis, we also have toponyms, which is place names, villages, cities, rivers. Direct quote here. First, there are toponyms. Slavic place names are found throughout Greece. The German linguist Wasmer has listed some 429 from the Peloponnesian Peninsula alone, which is funny because 429 is roughly the amount of Greeks that stalk me on a day-to-day basis on social media. So kind of lined up there. So, and this is more of a summary here. Direct quote. The written sources confirm this conclusion. None of the written sources are ideal, but their weight is still significant. We have Isidore of Seville, that states in the 5th year of Heraclius' rule, 615, the Slavs took Greece from the Romans. Willibald, a pilgrim to Jerusalem, states that Monifmasia in Peloponnesus was a Slavic territory. The Breviator of Strabo states that the Slavs had occupied all of Epirus, most of Hellas, the Peloponnesus, and Macedonia. Finally, we have Constantine VI Porphyrogenitus, who writes in De Thematibus, the book on the themes, in the whole country, the Peloponnesus was Slavonicized and became barbarous when a deadly plague ravaged the universe. Wow. The whole of the Peloponnesian Peninsula. So, what do we have here? It is clear that the Slavs came down to Greece. So why does Greece not call itself Slavic today? Well, partially their, line of thinking is abdicated. It's not there. But let's take a look at what John Fine has to say, a little bit more PC and kosher than good old Mario Hristovski. He says, it is evident that in this time period, a great deal of ethnic mixture between Slavs and Greeks occurred. Probably few pure-blooded Greeks, if any, existed prior to the Slavic invasions. A few centuries later, many Albanians migrated in these regions and further increased the ethnic mixtures. However, and this is the big however, the resultant population was ethnically mixed, but the Greek language and culture triumphed. And by the 10th century, most of the population of Greece, including the Peloponnesian Peninsula, believed itself to be Greek and therefore can also be considered. So in layman's terms, what does that mean? Well, you can be half Slavic. You may not even be any Greek. If you feel yourself Greek, if you speak Greek, feel Greek culture, if you're Orthodox, for all intents and purposes, you're Greek. You may not have any relation to Pericles or to the heroes of 300, the Leonidas and all them. You may not have any descent from them. You could have come from Asia Minor. You could have come from the Carpathian swamps. If you felt Greek and you thoroughly expressed a Greek identity, you're Greek. And that's the only way the modern Greek state exists. If you look at the first constitution of Greece, it's very clear. To be considered Greek, you have to be baptized in a Greek church and speak the Greek language. None of their identity has anything to do with anything scientific. It's all identities at the end of the day are social constructs, but the Greek identity is the mother of all social constructs. How else do you take a place that was speaking Albanian up until 200 years ago and make them think that they're the descendants of Pericles? How? It's all an imagined reality. So all identities are imagined. But that's the case. It's cultural expression. So think about Macedonians. If we are genetically related to the Macedonians, but culturally we have nothing to do with the ancient Macedonians, does that still make us Macedonians? That's a very interesting question. So let's take a look at that in another video. What you have to remember from this video is the following. The Slavic migration, if it is a migration, was messy. Different circumstances led to the different formations of identity in both Macedonia and Bulgaria. And if we're Slavs, Greeks are sure as hell Slavs, even if they don't care to admit it. So we'll visit these issues in the next episode. In the meantime, folks, it's great to be back. I'm going to see you again soon. In the meantime, stay safe and keep fighting for Macedonia.